Subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and keep your powder dry, because what you're about to witness is the spark that lit the longest fuse in American history. The rifle cracked like the sky splitting open, and 17-year-old Elias Crow kissed the red Virginia dirt with a hole punched clean through his shoulder, blood pooling warm and fast enough to steam in the October chill. This is the long fuse. He tasted iron and clay, the night air suddenly thick with sulfur, and the copper tang of his own life leaking out. Somewhere above him, boots pounded across the Baltimore and Ohio bridge, lanterns swinging like drunken stars. Elias pressed his cheek to the ground and tried to count heartbeats instead of seconds. 1, 2, 3, until the pain sharpened into something he could use, a blade instead of a wound. Across the armory yard, John Brown's voice rose steady as a hymn. "Hold the gate, boys. The Lord's work ain't done till the chains are dust." Elias had heard that voice for 3 days straight, riding down from the Maryland Heights with 21 men who believed scripture and gunpowder were twins. Brown's beard was frost white, his eyes winter blue, and when he spoke of Canaan, it sounded less like a promise than a threat. Elias had signed on because his mother's grave was still fresh and his father's silence louder than any sermon. The mountains had taught him to shoot straight. Brown taught him to aim at history. Now history aimed back. He rolled onto his good side, dragged the infield across his lap, and bit the cartridge with teeth that wouldn't stop chattering. Paper tore. Powder spilled like black snow. His left arm hung useless, but the right still knew its catechism. Ramrod, ball, cap. He primed the nipple, half-cocked, and crawled toward the shadow of the engine house. Inside, firelight licked the brick walls. Dangerfield Newby reloaded his sharps with the slow grace of a man who had all night and no tomorrow. Newby's wife and 7 children waited on a plantation 60 miles south. Every bullet he fired was a down payment on their freedom. He nodded once at Elias, acknowledgement, not comfort, and went back to his loophole. Outside, the militia found their courage. A volley shredded the night. Lead bees whined through the open door and buried themselves in the far wall with dull thuds. Someone screamed. Elias smelled singed wool and worse. "Bar the gate," Brown roared. 2 raiders heaved a raffle crate across the threshold. Another dragged the body of Haywood Shepherd, free black man, wrong place, first blood, out of the doorway like a sack of grain. Elias watched the corpse's boots scrape furrows in the dust and felt the world tilt. This was not how the pamphlets described it. The pamphlets had no smell.
He found a firing slit between 2 bricks, knelt, and sighted on a lantern 20 yards away. The militiaman carrying it wore a store-bought coat and the wide eyes of a shopkeeper playing soldier. Elias exhaled, squeezed, and the lantern exploded in a bloom of orange. The man dropped, shrieking, clawing at his face. Elias worked the lever, chambered another round, and did not look away. Minutes bled into hours. The moon climbed, cold and indifferent. Brown paced the engine house floor, Bible in one hand, sword in the other, quoting Isaiah between orders. "I have trodden the winepress alone." His sons Oliver and Watson lay wounded in the corner, pale as parchment. Watson's breath came in wet bubbles. Oliver stared at the ceiling as if answers were written there. Elias's shoulder had gone numb, which was mercy. He reloaded by feel now, teeth and right hand only. Each shot kicked the stock into his collarbone like a mule. Smoke layered the room until eyes watered and throats rasped. Someone passed a canteen. The water tasted of rust and gun oil. At 3 a.m. the militia tried the gate again. This time they brought a log battering ram. The first impact shook dust from the rafters. The second splintered the crate barricade. Brown's men wedged muskets through the gap and fired point blank. Screams outside, screams inside. Elias saw a hand reach through the widening crack, fingers groping for the latch, and he bayoneted it without thinking. The hand withdrew, trailing red ribbons. Dawn crept gray over the ridges. The raiders' powder was nearly gone. So was hope. Brown gathered them in a circle, voice soft now, almost tender. "If we fall, Let it be said we struck the first blow for the slave. Let them remember the year, the hour, the spark. Elias wanted to ask what came after the spark, after the chain stayed locked and the masters laughed, but the words stuck behind his teeth. Then the Marines arrived. They came down the street in perfect order, blue coats and polished bayonets catching the first pink light. At their head rode a Virginia colonel with a face like carved granite, Robert E. Lee, 40 years before the world would learn his name in bloodier classrooms. Behind him, a young lieutenant named J.E.B. Stewart carried a white flag he had no intention of honoring. Lee's voice carried across the yard, calm as Sunday. Surrender in the name of the United States. Brown answered with a single rifle shot that chipped brick near Stewart's ear. The Marines fixed bayonets. A sledgehammer rose and fell against the engine house door. Wood screamed. Elias fired until the Enfield clicked empty, then drew the bowie knife his father had given him the day he turned 13. The blade felt small against the coming tide. The door gave. Blue uniforms poured in like water through a broken dam. Bayonets flashed. Someone clubbed Elias across the temple. The world tilted, righted again, tilted again. He stabbed upward, felt the knife catch cloth and meat. Then a rifle butt smashed into his wrist and the blade spun away. Hands pinned him. Rope bit his wrists. Through the haze he saw Brown on his knees, sword broken, beard streaked with blood, but eyes still burning. A Marine raised a musket to finish him, and Lee's voice cut the air. Alive, damn you, alive! And the blow fell short. They dragged the raiders into the morning light. Townsfolk jeered. A woman spat on Elias as he stumbled past. His shoulder had started bleeding again. Each heartbeat painted the ground red. He looked back once at the engine house, pockmarked, smoking, already myth, and saw a Marine nail a placard on the door. Property of the United States. The prisoners were marched to the town jail under guard. Elias's legs gave out halfway. 2 Marines hauled him the rest of the way by the armpits. Inside the cell, straw smelled of piss and older blood. They chained his ankles to an iron ring. The door clanged shut. Brown was in the next cell, dictating a letter to the bars as if they were a pulpit. I, John Brown, am now quite certain that the crimes of this guilty land will never be purged away but with blood. Elias leaned his head against the wall and listened to the old man's voice until it blurred into the pounding in his skull. He thought of his mother's grave under the sugar maples, of his father's silence, of the mountains that seemed so tall until the world proved taller. Sleep took him between one breath and the next. He woke to the smell of fried fatback and the sound of chains. A guard slid a tin plate through the bars. Cornbread and salt pork. Elias ate with his right hand, left arm swollen purple to the elbow. Across the corridor, Dangerfield Newby stared at nothing. Sometime in the night, word had come. Militia found Newby's letters to his wife on his body and mailed her his ears. October slid into November. The trial was swift, the verdict certain. Brown stood in court with crutches and no remorse, quoting scripture until the judge threatened to gag him. Elias testified because they made him, voice cracking on every third word. The prosecutor called him a deluded boy led astray by fanaticism. The defense called him nothing at all.
On December 2, they hanged John Brown in Charlestown. Elias watched from a wagon bed, wrists bound, Marines on every side. The old man climbed the scaffold steps unaided, kissed a slave child held up by its mother, and dropped through the trap with a snap that echoed like the first shot at Harper's Ferry. His body swung gentle in the wind, beard catching sunlight like frost. That night, Elias dreamed of fire. He stood on a ridge above a burning valley, and every farm, every mansion, every courthouse blazed. In the dream, he was not 17, but 70, and the fire had a voice. You lit this. Now carry it. He woke, gasping. The cell was dark, the chains cold. Somewhere a guard coughed. Elias pressed his forehead to the bars and whispered the only prayer he knew. Let it mean something. Winter hardened. They moved the prisoners to richer jails, poorer hopes. Elias's shoulder knit crooked. The joint would ache when storms came for the rest of his life. In February, they offered him a deal. Name names, swear loyalty, walk free. He thought of Brown twisting at the end of a rope, of Newby's ears in an envelope, of Hayworth Shepherd staring surprised at the stars. He spat in the warden's coffee. Spring brought a new president, tall, sad-eyed, voice like a prairie wind. Abraham Lincoln spoke of a house divided and men who meant what they said. Elias heard the words through iron bars and felt the fuse hiss closer. In April 1861, the fuse reached its end. Cannons opened on Fort Sumter at dawn. Church bells rang from Maine to Texas. Men who had never held a rifle enlisted by the regiment. Elias Crow, prisoner no longer, released in the chaos of secession, forgotten by a nation suddenly busy with bigger fish, walked out of Charlestown with a limp, a crooked shoulder, and the Enfield they never bothered to take back. He crossed the Potomac at night, water cold as judgment. On the Maryland side, a Union patrol stopped him. The sergeant was young, barely shaving. Name and business. Elias Crow. I've come to finish what I started. The sergeant looked at the scar tissue peeking above Elias's collar, at the rifle older than the Republic, and stepped aside. Virginia seceded 3 days later. Elias rode south with the first wave, a ghost in gray, the mountains at his back and fire in his teeth. He would fight at Manassas, where the creeks ran red, at Antietam, where the cornfield devoured a generation in one morning, at Gettysburg, where the ridge held and the dream cracked in half. But that was still years away, miles of mud and smoke and unmarked graves. On this night, the night the war began in earnest, Elias stood on the banks of the river and watched the stars wheel overhead. Somewhere behind him, Harper's Ferry smoldered in memory. Somewhere ahead, 1,000,000 men marched toward each other with the same look he had seen in John Brown's eyes. He worked the Enfield's lever once, chamber empty, just to hear the sound. Then he slung it across his good shoulder and started walking south, one limping step at a time, carrying the long fuse coiled inside his chest like a second heart. The war had 1,000 fathers, but only one midwife, and her name was a 17-year-old boy bleeding in the dirt the night the sky split open. Years later, old men would argue over who fired the first shot. They would never agree. Elias never told. He carried the secret to a soldier's grave outside Petersburg, the Enfield broken across his knees, the crooked shoulder finally still. But the fuse kept burning, underground and unseen, through Appomattox, through Reconstruction, through Jim Crow and freedom rides and burning buses. It burned still. In courtrooms and classrooms, in the hush before a verdict, in the crack of a different kind of whip, because some sparks refuse to die, and some boys never stop falling.
The road south from Charlestown was nothing but wheel ruts and frost-heaved clay, yet Elias walked it as though it were paved with prophecy. Dawn bled pale over the Blue Ridge, and every farmhouse he passed had a new flag, some the old Stars and Stripes, some the newborn palmetto of South Carolina, some just a red rag tied to a broomstick because the women had nothing else. Dogs barked at his shadow. Children stared from doorways with eyes too old for their faces. He kept the Enfield low, muzzle down, but the limp gave him away. Every third step dragged, heel scraping like a warning. At a crossroads tavern outside Winchester, A knot of men in butternut coats argued over coffee, thick as axle grease. One of them, a blacksmith with forearms like hams, noticed the rifle first and the blood-stiff shirt second. "You from the ferry?" he asked, voice low. Elias nodded once. The blacksmith spat tobacco juice the color of creek water. "Heard tell Brown's boys was all kilt or strung up." Some was, some wasn't. A silence settled, thick as the coffee. Then the blacksmith slid a tin cup across the bar. "Drink. War's thirsty work." The coffee scalded Elias's tongue and warmed the hollow place behind his ribs. He drank it black, no sugar, the way his mother had taught him when rations ran thin. When he set the cup down, the blacksmith was already rolling a cigarette with one hand. "Stonewall Jackson's raising a brigade at the college," he said. "Reckon a feller who stood with Brown could teach him a thing or two about night fighting." Elias almost laughed. The idea of John Brown's ghosts drilling cadets in gray was too strange for morning, but the war had already begun to eat strangeness for breakfast. He left the tavern with a strip of salt pork in his pocket, and the blacksmith's name, Jeb Labruder, burned into memory. The road widened into the Shenandoah Valley, wheat stubble silver with frost, and the mountains standing guard like blue-robed giants. By noon, he reached the outskirts of Winchester, where the Virginia Military Institute cadets drilled in perfect squares, their breath pluming white. A colonel on a bay horse watched from the fence, arms folded, face carved from the same stone as the mountains. Thomas Jonathan Jackson. Even then, before the nickname, before the prayers on horseback, men felt the gravity around him. Elias felt it like a hand on his shoulder. He stepped forward. "Sir, Elias Crow. I was at Harper's Ferry." "Brown's raider?" "Brown's soldier." Pause. Then, "Can you drill?" "I can shoot." Jackson's mouth twitched, almost a smile. "We'll start with drill. Shooting comes after." That night, Elias slept in a stable loft, straw for mattress, the smell of horse and leather better than any feather bed. In the morning, he stood in ranks with boys who had never seen blood, learning to wheel and countermarch until his bad shoulder screamed. Jackson watched like a hawk, voice soft but carrying to the back row. "Precision is piety, gentlemen. Sloppy drill is blasphemy." Elias learned. He learned to load in 9 times while standing on one foot. He learned to fire by volley until the ramrod glowed cherry red. He learned that Jackson prayed before battles and after, voice low, eyes closed, as if the Lord kept office hours on the battlefield. April became May. The valley greened. Cherry blossoms drifted like snow across the drill field. Then came the telegram from Richmond. Federal troops massing at Alexandria, move south to Manassas Junction. The brigade packed in 2 hours, tents struck, wagons loaded, boys writing letters they might never mail. Elias rode in the supply wagon, Enfield across his knees, the road unspooled south like a ribbon of dust. They camped beside Bull Run Creek, water the color of weak tea, willows whispering secrets to the current. On the night of July 20th, Jackson gathered the officers around a map spread on a cracker barrel. He said, "McDowell comes tomorrow. We hold the stone bridge till Beauregard arrives. Then we push." Elias, only a private, should not have been there, but Jackson had taken to asking him questions about night marches, about how Brown's men moved silent through the Maryland woods. Elias answered plain, no flourish. Jackson listened the same way. Dawn on the 21st broke hot and hazy. Elias stood on Matthews Hill with the 2nd Virginia, muskets stacked, canteens sloshing. Across the creek, Union guns flashed. The first shell screamed overhead and buried itself in a cornfield, dirt fountaining 50 feet high. A boy beside Elias, 16 if he was a day, dropped his musket and pissed himself. Elias picked up the musket, handed it back. "Breathe through your nose, son. Shells make noise. Bullets make widows."
The boy nodded, white-faced, and chambered around. The battle unfolded like a fever dream. Blue coats crested the hill in perfect lines, bayonets glittering. Confederate artillery answered, canister hissing through the air like angry hornets. Elias fired until the barrels scorched his hand through the glove, then fixed bayonet and waited. When the Federals came close enough to see the sweat on their faces, Jackson rode behind the line, hat raised like a battle standard. "There is Jackson standing like a stone wall," someone shouted, Bernard B., dying minutes later, and the name stuck. Elias felt the line stiffen. Men who had been ready to run found their feet. The line held. Then it advanced. Elias stepped over bodies in blue and gray, boots squelching and blood warm as fresh milk. He bayoneted a Union sergeant who begged for water in a German accent. He shot a captain who tried to rally his company with a broken sword. He did not feel 17 anymore. By afternoon, the Federal Army cracked. Civilians who had come with picnic baskets fled in carriages, wheels spinning. Elias watched a congressman's wife lose her hat to a cannonball and did not laugh. Laughter felt like a language he had forgotten. That night, the brigade camped on the battlefield, too tired to bury the dead. Elias sat against a rail fence, cleaning the Enfield by firelight. The barrel was fouled black. He scraped it with a bayonet tip until his fingers bled. Jackson walked the lines, stopping to speak to every man who still had a voice. When he reached Elias, he said only, "You did not run. Running's for men with somewhere to go." Jackson studied him a long moment. "Tomorrow we march to Richmond, then north again. The war will be longer than any of us guess." Elias nodded. He had guessed already. Summer burned into fall. The army grew, shrank, grew again. Elias rose to corporal, then sergeant, because he could read a map and keep his head when shells fell. He taught night scouting to boys who had never seen a mountain. He wrote no letters. His father had disowned him the day the newspapers printed his name beside Brown's. But he carried his mother's locket, a cheap thing with a curl of her hair, and touched it when the loneliness got loud. In October, they fought at Ball's Bluff, a slaughter on a riverbank, where Union boys drowned trying to swim the Potomac in full kit. Elias pulled a wounded Federal from the water, a lieutenant with a Harvard accent and a bullet in the thigh. The boy wept when Elias bound the wound with his own shirt. "You're one of Brown's men," the lieutenant whispered. "I read the trials." Elias tied the knot tight. "Read slower next time." Winter quarters at Centerville. Snow muffled the world. Elias learned to play whist, to chew coffee beans when rations ran short, to sleep sitting up so the cold would not kill him. He dreamed of Harper's Ferry every night, the engine house door splintering, Brown's beard catching firelight, the smell of blood and wet wool. He woke with the Enfield in his hands more often than not. Summer 1862 brought George McClellan up the peninsula like a cautious bridegroom. Elias's brigade, now the Stonewall Brigade, proud and ragged, marched south to meet him. They fought at Williamsburg in a thunderstorm, rain hissing on bayonets. Elias killed a man with a rock when his musket misfired, felt the skull give like a rotten pumpkin. He vomited behind a peach tree and kept moving. Then Jackson's Valley Campaign, a masterpiece of misdirection and forced marches. 30 miles a day, boots worn through, men dropping from exhaustion. Elias learned to sleep in the saddle, to eat hardtack crawling with weevils, to trust the map in Jackson's head more than the ground under his feet. They whipped Banks at Front Royal, Fremont at Cross Keys, Shields at Port Republic. The Shenandoah ran red in a dozen places. Elias saw his first balloon, a Union observation craft drifting over the Luray Valley like a pale moon. He shot at it with the Enfield, missed, and laughed for the first time in a year. The laugh scared him more than the balloon. June brought the 7 days. Heat shimmered off the Chickahominy swamps. Elias fought at Gaines Mill, bayonet charge across a field of waist-high wheat, the stalks whipping his face like green fire. He saw Jackson freeze at a critical moment, Stonewall himself, staring at the ground as if it had betrayed him, and felt the first crack in the myth. At Malvern Hill, the Union guns tore the Confederate lines to pieces. Elias lay in a ditch with the dead piled around him, listening to the whistle of shells and the wet sound of men breathing through ruined lungs. When night fell, he crawled out carrying a boy from Botetourt County, whose legs ended at the knees. The boy died at dawn, whispering his sweetheart's name, Clara, Clara, like a prayer. Richmond was saved, but the cost was a ledger no one could balance. Elias walked the hospital wards, rows of cots, and the smell of gangrene sweet as rotting apples. He found Jeb Magruder, the blacksmith from Winchester, minus an arm and half his face. "You still got that Enfield?" Magruder rasped. Elias showed him the rifle, stopped cracked but true. "Good. War ain't done with you yet." July. The Army licked its wounds. Lincoln called for 300,000 more men. Elias heard the news and felt the fuse hiss louder. He was 19 now, beard coming in patchy, eyes older than the mountains. He wrote his first letter, not to his father, but to the locket. "Mama, the world is wider than I thought, and narrower too. I keep walking south because north feels like a lie."
August brought Pope and Second Manassas. Elias fought on the old battlefield, ghosts underfoot. Jackson held the railroad cut like a badger in a hole, Federals throwing themselves against it, wave after wave. Elias fired until the Enfield's barrel warped, then used it as a club. When Longstreet's corps slammed into the Union left, the earth shook. Elias watched bluecoats run and felt nothing but tired. September. Lee crossed the Potomac. "Maryland, my Maryland," the song went, but Maryland stayed mostly loyal and mostly quiet. Elias marched through Frederick with blistered feet, past women who watched from upper windows with faces like closed doors. At an orchard outside town, he stole apples, tart and hard, and ate them until his stomach cramped. Sharpsburg, Antietam. The name would be a scar across the nation's memory. They reached the creek at dusk on September 16, cornfields golden in the slanting light. Jackson posted the Stonewall Brigade in the West Woods, trees thick as a cathedral. Elias smelled wood smoke and apples and the faint rot of the creek. He slept with the Enfield across his chest, dreaming of Harper's Ferry again. Only this time the engine house was full of corn stalks, and the dead sat up to watch him reload. Dawn on the 17th was red as judgment. Union guns opened from across the creek, 100 throats roaring at once. Elias woke to the whistle of shells and the wet slap of a Minié ball, taking the man beside him in the throat. Blood sprayed hot across Elias's face. He wiped it away with his sleeve and started shooting. The cornfield, 30 acres of slaughter. Men advanced in lines, fired, fell, were replaced by the next line. Elias loaded and fired until his hands blistered, until the smoke was so thick he could not see the enemy, only the flash of their muskets. He saw a Union color-bearer plant his flag in the corn and take 12 bullets at once, the flag falling slow as a leaf. He saw a rabbit dart between the rows, untouched, and envy it. By noon, the brigade was down to a regiment, the regiment to a company. Elias found himself in the sunken road with Jackson himself, the general standing on the bank like a prophet, coat torn, eyes wild. "Give them the bayonet!" Jackson shouted, and the men obeyed because obedience was all that was left. They held the road until the barrels glowed, until the dead were piled 3 deep and the living climbed over them to shoot. Union troops broke against it like waves against a cliff. Then Hooker's corps flanked them, and the road became a trap. Elias retreated through the corn, tripping over bodies, the Enfield empty,
bayonet bent. He found a fallen federal musket, heavier than his own, and kept moving. Dusk. The battle stuttered to a stop, both sides too exhausted to continue. Elias sat on a rail fence beside Antietam Creek, washing blood from his hands in water already pink. Across the field, a Union band played Home Sweet Home, and Confederate boys cried openly. Elias did not cry. He had forgotten how. That night he walked the field with a lantern, looking for the boy from Botetourt County who had died whispering Clara. He never found him. There were too many. Lee retreated across the Potomac under cover of rain. Elias marched rear guard, boots full of water, the Enfield slung muzzle down to keep the powder dry. At Shepherdstown they turned and mauled a Union pursuit, Elias firing from behind a stone wall until his shoulder, old wound and new, locked solid. He watched Federal soldiers drown in the river, packs dragging them under, and felt the fuse burn another inch. Winter again. Fredericksburg. Elias stood on Mary's Heights with the brigade, watching Union waves break against the stone wall below. The slaughter was mechanical, almost boring. He fired until the musket kicked no more, then passed it to a boy behind him and took another. When the firing stopped, the ground in front of the wall was carpeted blue, the bodies so thick artillery caissons could not pass. Afterward, Elias walked down to the wall under flag of truce, carrying canteens for the wounded. A Union sergeant, gut-shot and dying, grabbed his sleeve. "Tell my wife," he gasped. "Tell her I was brave." Elias wrote the name in a notebook he kept for that purpose only. Sergeant Daniel Morrow, 19th Massachusetts. Brave. He would mail the notebook north after the war if there was a north left to mail to. Spring 1863. Chancellorsville. Jackson's masterpiece and his undoing. Elias scouted the flank march through the tangled wilderness, guiding the column by starlight, whispering passwords to sentries who smelled of whiskey and fear. On May 2nd, they struck Hooker's right like a hammer. Elias fought in the thickets where men fired at muzzle flashes and stabbed at shadows. He saw Jackson ride past, hatless, eyes shining, and felt the old pull, madness and genius braided tight.
Elias had no answer. Jackson died 3 days later, raving about pushing the enemy into the river. The army mourned like a family losing its father. Elias mourned too, though he could not have said why. May turned to June. Lee marched north again, this time into Pennsylvania. Elias crossed the Potomac at dusk, water to his waist, the Enfield held high. Children lined the banks waving rebel flags. Old men pressed apples and pies into their hands. Elias ate a pie standing in the road, crust flaking on his beard, and felt almost human. Gettysburg. 3 days that bent the war like a green stick. July 1. Elias fought in the woods west of town, driving Federals through the streets in a running battle. He captured a Union colonel who offered his sword with shaking hands. Elias took the sword, broke it over his knee, and gave the man water instead. "War's not about steel," he said. "It's about what you do with it." July 2. The brigade assaulted the peach orchard, wheat fields, Devil's Den. Elias climbed Little Round Top with the 4th Texas, rocks slick with blood, the air full of sulfur and screams. He bayoneted a Union officer on the summit, felt the man's watch chain snap under the blade. The officer's eyes were brown, like his mother's. He closed them with shaking fingers. Night. He sat on the rocks, cleaning the Enfield by moonlight, the town below him burning in patches. Somewhere a banjo played Lorena. Elias hummed along, voice cracked from powder smoke. July 3. Pickett's charge. Elias watched from the woods on Seminary Ridge, brigade held in reserve. He saw the gray lines step off across the mile of open ground, saw
saw the Union guns open like the gates of hell. He saw the charge falter, break, retreat. He did not cheer. He had seen enough. That night, Lee gathered the army for retreat. Elias marched south through rain that turned the roads to glue, past wagons mired axle deep, past wounded left to the mercy of federal surgeons. At Williamsport, the Potomac was in flood. They waited 3 days under Union shells. Elias slept in a barn with the horses, dreaming of cornfields full of rabbits. They crossed at last on a pontoon bridge, the river running red below. Virginia soil again. He kissed it, not for patriotism, but because it was solid. The war settled into a grim stalemate. Elias fought in the wilderness again, at Spotsylvania, where the mule shoe became a charnel house, at Cold Harbor, where Grant's men wrote their names on scraps of paper and pinned them to their coats so the burial details would know who they had been. Elias wrote his own name, folded it small, and tucked it inside the locket with his mother's hair. The Overland Campaign. 40 days of continuous fighting. The army shrinking like a snowball in hell. Elias rose to lieutenant. Commissions came cheap when officers died faster than promotions, leading a company of boys who had never seen a harvest. He taught them to dig trenches deep, to sleep with their muskets, to write letters they might never send. Petersburg. The siege. Elias lived in a hole in the ground, eating rats when the rations gave out. The Enfield replaced by a captured Spencer repeater that fired 7 times before reloading. He led night raids through the saps, cutting Union picket lines, bringing back prisoners who wept at the sight of Confederate coffee. He learned to hate the smell of wet clay and the sound of his own heartbeat. June 25. The crater. Union miners tunneled under the Confederate lines and packed the tunnel with 4 tons of powder. Elias was on picket when the earth erupted, a geyser of dirt and men and timbers. He ran toward the smoke, Spencer barking, and found a hole 50 feet deep, filled with screaming bluecoats. The brigade counterattacked, pouring down the sides of the crater like avenging angels. He shot a man point blank who was trying to surrender, saw the surprise in the man's eyes, and shot him again to be sure. Afterward, he sat on the crater's rim, hands shaking so badly he could not light his pipe. A chaplain found him there, offered absolution. Elias laughed until he cried. Winter 1864-65. The trenches froze. Elias's beard went gray at the temples, though he was not yet 23. He wrote in the notebook every night by candle stub. Names, dates, small kindnesses. Private Amos Reed, 18th Virginia, shared his last onion. Lieutenant Colonel William Pegram, artillery, hummed Mozart while the shells fell. The notebook grew thick as a hymnal. April 1, 1865.
Elias laughed, the sound wet. Been dying since '59, Doc. What's one more? They gave him laudanum. He dreamed of the engine house again, only this time the door held, and Brown stood beside him quoting scripture while the Marines hammered outside. In the dream, Elias was 70, beard white as frost, and the fire in the valley burned without consuming. He woke to silence. The guns had stopped. A nurse with kind eyes told him Lee had surrendered at Appomattox. Elias closed his eyes and felt the fuse finally burn out, a soft pop somewhere behind his ribs. They carried him north on a litter, then a train, then a steamboat up the James. Richmond was ashes and rebirth, chimneys standing like grave markers. Elias watched from the deck, side bandaged, fever burning low. Children waved from the banks. He lifted a hand in salute. The hospital in Washington smelled of carbolic and lye.
Elias lay in a ward with men who had fought on both sides, the partitions between beds the only borders left. A Union veteran with one arm read him the surrender terms from a newspaper. Elias listened and felt nothing but tired. On the last night the fever broke. He woke clear-headed, the pain a dull companion. Moonlight striped the ward. He fumbled for the locket, opened it, and looked at the curl of hair, still brown, still his mother's. He whispered the only prayer he had left. Let it mean something. Dawn. The surgeon came, surprised to find him alive. You're a tough one, Reb. Got a war to finish. The surgeon laughed. War's over, son. Not mine. They discharged him in May. No parole needed. The Confederacy a memory. Elias walked south on crutches, the Spencer left behind, the Bowie knife in his belt. He crossed the Potomac at Harper's Ferry, rebuilt now, the engine house a tourist curiosity. Children played where Hayward Shepherd had died. Elias stood on the bridge and looked down at the water, swift and indifferent. He kept walking, through the valley, past farms where black families worked their own land, past white families who would not meet his eyes. He slept in barns, in churches, under the stars. His side healed crooked, like the shoulder. He was 23 going on 70. West Virginia now, the new state carved from the old. Elias followed the railroad west, then south again, drawn by a pull he could not name. In the mountains of North Carolina, he found a cabin abandoned since the war. Chimney fallen, garden gone to weed. He rebuilt the chimney with stones from the creek, planted corn with a broken hoe. The first harvest was thin, but it was his. He married a woman named Clara, same name as the boy from Bodetort had whispered, widow of a Union soldier, 2 children with eyes too old for their faces. They did not speak of the war at first. Then they spoke of nothing else. She taught him to read better. He taught his sons to shoot straight. They named the first child born to them Elias Brown Crow, and the name was a stone in both their mouths. Years passed. The country stitched itself together with railroads and resentment. Elias farmed, preached occasionally in a clapboard church, told no one about the notebook buried under the hearthstone. He watched Reconstruction rise and fall, watched black legislators elected and driven out, watched the Klan ride with sacks over their heads. He did not ride with them. He did not stop them either. The fuse had burned out, but the ashes were still warm. A letter came, forwarded from post to post, thick paper, government seal. Inside, an invitation to the dedication of a monument at Harper's Ferry. John Brown, abolitionist martyr, the engine house restored. Elias read it twice, then burned it in the cook stove. Clara found him on the porch that night, staring at the mountains. You going? He shook his head. Some fires you don't visit. You just carry the heat. She sat beside him, head on his good shoulder. The children were grown, the corn high. Somewhere a whippoorwill called. Elias died in the spring of 1898, fever from a cut that would not heal. Clara buried him under a sugar maple on the ridge, the Enfield broken across his grave like a cross. She carved the stone herself. Elias Crow, 1842-1898. He lit the fuse. On the day the stone was set, a storm rolled down from the Blue Ridge, lightning stitching the sky. Clara stood in the rain with her grown sons, watching the maple leaves turn silver. When the thunder spoke, it sounded almost like a rifle shot, far away, long ago. The fuse was cold now, but the echo traveled on, through courtrooms and classrooms, through Selma and Montgomery, through Watts and Detroit, through Charlottesville and beyond. Every time a chain rattled, every time a voice rose against the dark, the boy fell again in the red Virginia clay, blood steaming in the October chill. Some sparks refused to die, and some stories refused to end.